Good morning and welcome to Rising. We've got a great show for you today. I'm joined by Niall Stanage, who's looking gregarious in green.
I love all the alliteration here, Robby. We have a spicy show today, I must say. A whole gamut of topics from Syria to Don Lemon and everything in between. So looking forward to that.
Yes, indeed.
Let's get started. What is on your radar?
Well, a familiar topic, Niall. You've heard a lot about this one, but I can't resist doing it again. Jake Tapper and Alex Thompson are authors of a new book, Original Sin, which details the cover-up of President Joe Biden's cognitive decline by his inner circle and closest advisors. We are now being treated to details from the book, which include that Biden's closest advisors worried he would need a wheelchair if he had to serve a second term. The latest news in the last 24 hours is that Biden's final ouster was precipitated by the actor George Clooney because when they met at that fundraiser, Clooney felt Biden couldn't tell who he was. Now, that was probably a novel experience for George Clooney, who is one of the most recognizable faces in America. All these new details are horribly embarrassing, of course, for Team Biden and should utterly doom his advisors if they ever aspire to hold sway over public affairs ever again. But the real question is how much this matters for the media folks who covered, and some would say made excuses for, Joe Biden. Now, to their credit, it's true. Alex Thompson was more vocal than other people in the media, calling out Biden's infirmities, and has chided the media for being slow to cover the story. He has done that a number of times, and we appreciate it, certainly. But what about Jake Tapper? Remember, for instance, when he said this?
I think what we see on stage with Joe Biden, Jake, is very clearly a cognitive decline.
Okay.
That's what I'm referring to. It makes me uncomfortable
you are
to watch
no
somebody on stage
that's so amazing. It's so amazing to me that
try and figure out an answer.
A cognitive decline.
Well, when you're trying to tell me that what I was suggesting was
I think that you were mocking his stutter. Yeah, I think you were mocking his stutter, and I think you have absolutely no standing to diagnose somebody's cognitive decline.
Well, critics on the right are resurfacing that clip now that Tapper has aligned himself with the Biden critical team and is ruthlessly exposing those who cover for the former president as he progressed to the point of obvious incapacity. Now, you can say, no one knew. Why is Tapper any worse than anybody else? Of course, the problem is that lots of people knew. People in the media knew. Rising Friday's host Amber Duke was calling attention to problems with Biden since 2020 and 2021. Here's just a smattering of her headlines over the years. Maybe Amber, whom I adore, you can write off as a right-wing person. Okay, fine. But here's the real issue for Biden backers. Most Democrats, if you look at polls, thought he was too old to run for re-election. They said so. They expressed that view. So then the question becomes, well, how did the Jake Tappers of the world miss something that most ordinary Democratic voters clearly pick up on? Let's tally this up. On one hand, everybody knew there was something off about Joe Biden, and by everyone I mean the Democratic base. And on the other hand, you had a coterie of partisan, motivated Biden world dead enders, the veritable court eunuchs in this place, and they insist that nothing was wrong with His Majesty. How dare you even ask questions? The mainstream media had no questions of their own until George Clooney got offended. Then it was okay. Look, whether we have a president of the United States who's literally fit for office should not revolve around whether George Clooney is personally offended at his lack of recognition, in my humble opinion.
Here we are again, Robby.
Here we are again.
Decrepit Joe Biden and what is to be said about him. Look, I don't think Joe Biden was capable of serving a second term. I think that became obvious at the time of the debate. I think that's why I and lots of other people believed he should step aside after that debate. Then there's a separate question to me of whether the media conspired to keep it silent or keep it hidden, and that's the part that I'm much more skeptical of. Than you. I'm skeptical of the idea that it was a media conspiracy.
The media part, the people around him,
yes,
clearly conspired to keep it quiet to a degree.
Right, and according to this book, the people around him, the particularly closest circle of the people around him, conspired to keep it quiet even from other people in the White House and other Democratic politicians.
By limiting the meetings he was taking when you could talk to him only at the most favorable times for him. Yes.
Exactly, and pushing meetings later in the day, and later in the morning, and ending them earlier in the afternoon. So there's obviously a problem here. The issue, I think, is firstly, people tend not to accept, to my mind, that Biden's decline did clearly accelerate, I would say, in the second half of his first term. Yes, he always looked an old man. His gait had grown much stiffer. His voice had lost certainly a lot of its velocity. But I don't think until that debate you really saw the scale of the decline. And there were, in fairness to people like Jake Tapper and others in the media, there were instances where videos were deceptive. The famous one, I think, is a meeting in Europe, the G7, where it was framed as if Biden was sort of wandering off into the distance, when in fact he was waving at a parachutist.
That one, I will concede, was a little bit deceptive. I agree with you on that one, but there were like 3 of them at a row. One of them was from, I believe it was that George Clooney fundraiser, where that was one of the videos where he needed to be let off the stage by Obama. That one wasn't deceptive, and it got, it was all 3 at the same time. We're like, there's, these cheap fake videos that are being pushed forward. That's what Karine Jean-Pierre said. I agree on the one, you could maybe make that claim, although she made it sound like they were manipulated in some way. They were maybe edited in an unfair way. Yeah. But I don't think media figures like Jake Tapper were in on the conspiracy. But like even what you said about what the inner circle was doing, okay, so he was taking fewer meetings. There were things they were doing, and I can't help but think that if it was a figure that the media was more nakedly hostile to, they would have been asking questions about why is our access to Biden being limited? Why it would prompt them to do some real investigative work, as we're seeing with, for instance, John Fetterman, someone the media no longer likes very much, that they can get his inner circle to publish hit piece after hit piece. So it's the lack of. It's not that they were in on the conspiracy. It seemed like there's a lack of enthusiasm to get to the truth.
But aren't you, in a sense, adapting your language depending on what outcome you want? In Fetterman's case, you're saying the disclosure is a hit piece. And in Biden's case, you're saying they didn't go to the people who would be critical of him and they were at fault there. It surely has to be one or the other. In Fetterman's case, I think it is to our benefit that we have greater information. And in Biden's case, it would have been to our benefit.
I think Fetterman was not fit to run in the first place, is what I said when he was running for the Senate, given the stroke he'd suffered. I think if a lot, throwing pens over here,
yes. I
think if a lot of the recent information is accurate and fair, then I would have serious questions about him being able to serve, absolutely. I think we should have more people leave office for reasons of obvious cognitive or physical or age-related impairment. I'm more of a throw them all out, get in new people. They're not entitled to these seats. The way our politicians act like they deserve to be in power forever, when you wouldn't hire them to run, some of these people who are so beyond their actual capacity, you wouldn't hire them to be grocery store checkout people, and yet they're entitled to this position.
As I reiterate, I think that the book, Tapper's book, is called Original Sin, Tapper and Thompson's book, and the original sin, which I agree was the original problem, was Joe Biden deciding to run for a second term. Yeah. He could have been the transitional president and not done that. Now, where I think it becomes cloudier is his team to this day say where is the evidence of his decision-making being affected by cognitive impairment? There are lots of his decisions that I think were bad decisions, particularly, not to get back into the Israel-Gaza thing again, but I think his conduct there was catastrophic. But I don't think it was caused by cognitive decline, and that's, I think, a valid point.
Well, there is that, but I think when you're out of it in the way that he was, you're less likely to, or just more reliant on, your advisors and just the government to continue functioning by the bureaucrats who are in charge of things, which some people might ideologically think is a good thing. I tend to not think that, especially when it comes to foreign policy, where I want the democratically elected head of the government making the foreign policy decisions, not the same sort of, neoconservative in both parties, permanent foreign policy experts. Trump right now is doing a lot of things in the Middle East that I think are good, and I think you have at least some appreciation for, that I think stems from his own unique ideas or some of the ideas of the people he's brought in, that if you have someone who doesn't have like a vision and a drive to do something different, then you would never, I don't think you would have gotten any of these results under Biden, is what I'm saying.
I think we will be returning to Mr. Trump in the Middle East shortly.
Yes, we will, because the President Trump, actually called a former jihadist an attractive man. But it's a lot more complicated than that. We'll tell you why. Stay tuned. Well, for once, some Democratic Party lawmakers are praising President Trump for lifting sanctions on Syria. And President Trump also showered some praise of his own on a former jihadist.
To be fair, that former jihadist is now the president of Syria, Ahmed al-Sharaa, whom Trump met with yesterday. Here's Trump talking to reporters about their meeting.
How did you find the Syrian president?
Great. I think very good. Young, attractive guy, tough guy. You know, strong pass. Very strong pass fighter.
Does that worry you at all?
He's got a real shot at pulling it together.
Among the Democrats who applauded Trump were Senator Jeannie Shaheen, Congresswoman Sarah Jacobs, and Senator Chris Van Hollen. Regarding the sanctions on Syria being lifted, Jacobs told Politico, "This is a welcome step forward, and now Congress needs to do its part and repeal congressionally mandated sanctions too."
Meanwhile, Trump's comments about al-Sharaa didn't go over well with some. Podcaster Ed Krasenstein wrote on X, "You can't make excuses for this. This is unfathomable. Trump is literally praising a mass murderer who killed women and children."
You know, Ed Krasenstein is someone whose takes I don't mind every now and then. This is not one of them that I like.
Sure.
Look, a lot of killers, as Trump himself once said to Bill O'Reilly in my favorite interview ever, when Bill O'Reilly said, "But, you know, Putin's
a killer."
A killer. Said, "A lot of killers out there, Bill. You think we're so innocent?" I mean, it's true. The reality of politics is needing to work with governments and figures around the world who have done, in some cases, utterly reprehensible things. We don't have the power, the will, the desire to just nuke everybody we don't like and conquer the world. No one wants to do that. The Americans don't want to do that. You know, we go back, look at World War II. You had FDR, Churchill making an alliance with Stalin to defeat Hitler because that was more important. Politics and diplomacy is a complicated subject, and sometimes you gotta let bygones be bygones. I think it was right to be wary of this figure, given his ties to ISIS and al-Qaeda in the past. Absolutely, we should be on our guard, and we should continue to do that. But at the end of the day, he's the leader now of Syria. We didn't like the last guy. In fact, we contributed to the other guy's overthrow by having these sanctions in place. It is a different regime, so it doesn't make sense to have sanctions on them, especially sanctions that are actually causing crippling starvation to the people of Syria. Trump had a good meeting with him. That's good. I think we should move toward positive diplomacy with Syria. The theory being that will move them closer to our sphere of influence and have a positive relationship with the U.S. We shouldn't be so naive to think that's absolutely always going to happen in all cases, but this seems like a good first step to me. No?
Yeah, I don't really disagree with much of that. I think it is a complicated situation in Syria. I think there are legitimate reasons for being concerned about this guy beyond his past. I think it is important when people have a bleak or in some cases murderous past to acknowledge that people can change. He has distanced himself from the link to al-Qaeda that previously had put a US bounty on his head. The reason I say it's not just quite crystal clear is that there was a lot of violence just in March in Syria under this new government.
That is true. We interviewed someone who was an expert on Syria who had relatives in the region and really described some very harrowing stuff. It was a great interview.
Right.
So yes, still ongoing problems. But I would say, are those problems more likely to abate if we are doing diplomacy with the president and exerting some positive influence on it? I think that could be a possibility, right?
No, I think it could. And I think that as a broad matter, sanctions are often not that effective. Sometimes they can be, but a lot of times they exacerbate the suffering of regular folks, the general public in these countries, while regimes enrich themselves or have a lot of money salted away in the vaults.
And then the regime says, you're starving not because of me, but because of the imperialist colonizing
the great
West.
Satan. Yeah, no, absolutely. And in this case, we should also note that Trump has, to his credit, stood up to the Israelis again, who did not want sanctions lifted on the Syrians, who have gone into Syria in some cases to meet in terms of a military assault. And so that is, I think, something that we should see more of. I would be in favor of more American administrations being more skeptical of what Israel tells them.
And doing engagement. You know, one of our huge mistakes in the Middle East was with Libya, right? With Gaddafi, who was, you know, an actor who was not on board with America at all, was aligning our African nations against us, and then after some military action, then kind of got it and started to fall in line. And we contributed to his overthrow and horrific murder anyway. And I think that sent a terrible message throughout the Middle East, that even if you start getting along, we're still going to try to kill you because we want our ideal Western government in place.
Yeah, I mean, Gaddafi's such an appalling figure, though, in terms of the abuses of his own people, that I didn't shed too many tears for him. But the fact is that Libya has been engulfed since then in a lot of strife that has cost lots of other lives. It does get into that morally sketchy area of supporting strongmen leaders who can guarantee a degree of stability at the expense of human rights. I think there's reasons to be uncomfortable with that, but I don't think there's any ideal prescription for Syria, so I don't think this is particularly terrible.
Next up, AOC loses it on her Republican counterparts, but they're not having any of it. That's next. Stay with us.
Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez went scorched earth on her Republican counterparts, making a series of scathing comments at the crack of dawn Wednesday. She got into the heated exchange over miscarriages. That was during a House Energy and Commerce panel markup. Let's take a look.
Where 25% of your constituents are on Medicaid, 40% of your constituents are on Medicaid. And yes, I am talking.
Will the gentlelady yield?
I am talking to them, and I will not yield because it was a terribly disrespectful comment, and I will not yield to disrespectful men. Thank you very much.
The committee was discussing reforms to Medicaid requirements during a session that lasted past 3 a.m. Their package would allow pregnant or postpartum patients to exempt work requirements while receiving program services. When AOC asked how the changes would affect women who have miscarriages, she was met with this response.
In terms of some of the exemptions, pregnancy is covered, correct?
May I interrupt? I'm glad you're addressing us instead of speaking to the camera.
Yeah.
Keep going.
Pregnancy is covered, correct?
Users on social media came to AOC's defense. Attorney Howard Sklar writing, "We need to come to grips with the fact that she's just plain better at this than a lot of Republicans, and to treat her like the electoral threat that she is."
Others called out AOC's tangent. Rita Cragwell says, "We are the boss, you are out of order, you assume you speak for all, and you do not."
Big win for AOC here, I would argue, Robby, for the very simple reason that she was making a very substantive point. It was a substantive point that might not have got a whole lot of attention had she just asked her question, got an answer, and had that continue. And instead, this Republican Congressman Randy Weber of Texas made a big thing of it by going after her for alleging that she was playing to the cameras. What she was asking for, as you mentioned in the introduction, was clarification on whether women who suffer miscarriages would have to meet work requirements that the Republican Party wishes to impose on Medicaid recipients. That's obviously an important question, a substantive question, and it has now become headline news because the Republican congressman was, in my view, disrespectful, but more to the point, made this whole thing a headline-grabbing issue.
Yeah, fair enough. I think that is basically how it went down. AOC is pretty good at this, and yes, was kind of finding an angle on this issue that works to her political advantage, but there's nothing wrong with that, and it reflects the fact that there is going to be there's clearly skepticism if you look at polling among the electorate, even conservatives, about changes to Medicare and Medicaid that might result in people getting fewer benefits. Now, I am ideologically, to some degree, good with pursuing that anyway, because I think it needs to be done. On the work requirements, people some people really are enthusiastic about the idea of work requirements, and I think in an ideal world, I think it's reasonable that, if you're getting government benefits that you have because you don't have enough income or you don't have a job, you should be working toward employment as you still receive those benefits. However, I have become worried about just adding more regulation also to the healthcare system, because then somebody has to verify that you're doing this, so that's a government job we need. There's more paperwork, so that's a government job we need. And on some level, checking in on all these things to make sure people are jumping through all the extra hoops you've imposed to make the welfare more fair or distributed in some way you think is more correct or morally just, actually makes the system more expensive because you need people to verify it. And I don't always love that idea.
So I think here what we have is an argument that you're making somewhat in the abstract. There's nothing wrong with that. But it is cutting against the point that AOC raised, which is if a woman has just suffered a miscarriage and has income levels that would normally entitle her to Medicaid, she shouldn't then be compelled to be working in an injured and presumably traumatic state in order to avail of health coverage. And the whole idea that there should be work requirements, I disagree with on a moral basis, because I'm of the view that the provision of healthcare is in fact a human right. And the United States, as you're well aware, is the only developed nation that does not treat it in that way. And so these arguments that there should be a work requirement for treating someone who's just had a miscarriage seems just callous to me, honestly. And in relation to these specific proposals on Medicaid, it isn't just about people having reduced benefits. According to the CBO, it's about 8.6 million people could not have health insurance at all by 2034. That is an urgent threat. And AOC is rightly making the point about how it could impact people. She listed the high percentages of people in some of those Republican members' districts who are dependent upon Medicaid. These are basic, decent, human rights that are at danger of being stripped away.
Yes, I mean, we do on some level have just an ideological disagreement here. I mean, it's fine by me if there are exceptions in these requirements for people who have recently suffered an injury or to get a certain amount of time where you're recovering from an injury or a situation like a miscarriage. If that is an exception to the work requirements, but that I would be happy to support. So no real issue there. I mean, it's, but in terms of it being a moral right, that does just become a philosophical issue. I don't believe you can have a right to something that then someone else would be obligated to provide you. You have a right. It's negative rights versus positive rights, which viewers might know or not know what that means. But I have a right not to be coerced against. I have a right not to be killed or harmed or censored or those kinds of things. Do I have a right, to on some level, a right to healthcare would be a right to compel you if you're a doctor to serve me? How can that be a right?
It would simply be the right to have access to health care irrespective of your means, as happens in every other developed country in the world. Big differences there, and we'll see if there are more coming up, with a Wisconsin judge who's accused of helping an undocumented immigrant evade ICE agents. She has a strong message for prosecutors. Stick around to hear her argument.
Now, Democrats are up in arms decrying the arrest and indictment of a Wisconsin judge accused of hiding an undocumented immigrant from ICE agents.
And now the suspended judge, Hannah Dugan, is looking to have her federal charges tossed, believing prosecutors have no legal basis for their case. Attorneys for Dugan argue that the suspended judge has legal immunity for official acts she performed as a judge. Writing in a motion filed Wednesday, her lawyers argue that the government's prosecution of Judge Dugan is virtually unprecedented and entirely unconstitutional.
Now, Dugan's arrest set off a firestorm of criticism from Democrats who have condemned the decision to arrest the judge. Wisconsin Governor Tony Evers, a Democrat, posted a statement on X shortly after the judge's arrest, taking aim at the Trump administration's, quote, dangerous rhetoric to attack and attempt to undermine our judiciary at every level. Meanwhile, FBI Director Kash Patel made the administration's message very clear after the arrest, posting a picture of Dugan in handcuffs with the short message, "No one is above the law."
Now, the suspended judge is facing charges of obstructing a proceeding and concealing an individual to prevent arrest. She could get up to 6 years in prison if she's convicted on both counts. Dugan is expected to enter a not guilty plea at her arraignment later today.
Yeah, so the news here is the indictment, the response by the judge. We have discussed this before. I do think it is interesting to me how hard Democrats are going to defend her, because, it's a somewhat serious thing she was accused of. And you said when we discussed this previously that you you don't quite see it the way some of these Democrats are seeing it. Now, of course, she deserves her day in court, and she can argue that she didn't do any of this. It sounds like that's not her argument. Right. Tell me if I'm missing something. It sounds like she's arguing, it's my court, I have broad immunity to do what I want in my court, not, no, I didn't help some illegal immigrant escape. What are you talking about?
Right, she is arguing that, and this is one of the issues where I separate from the Democratic or liberal consensus, because this has been cast, and Tony Evers, I think, was doing part of this in the tweet we raised, being cast as a sort of Trump attempt to intimidate the judiciary. Now, I think there are lots of areas of American life that Trump has sought to intimidate, and I've said that here, but I just don't see this in that way. The accusation here is that there was an illegal immigrant in her court on a domestic violence charge, and she spirited him and his lawyer out the jury door to evade ICE agents. That seems, if true, to be pretty obviously in contravention of the law, and I don't see how she can be placed above the law. Now, in this filing that she talks about, or her lawyers talk about the thing being unconstitutional, they contend that one of the reasons for that is that judges are entitled to maintain order in their courtroom. Yes, in the abstract, but it seems a very gymnastic stretch to say that that's what's going on here. And also, just briefly, Robby, in making that argument, the judges' lawyers don't seem to put any limits on that argument. So, I mean, for the sake of demonstrating the hypothetical, if someone is causing uproar in your courtroom and a judge shot them, the judge couldn't turn around and say, well, I was maintaining order, so I'm immune from prosecution.
Right, it's not a private fiefdom or kingdom, exactly, which the judge has total authority. There is some case precedent that I read last time we discussed this about local or state or local officials don't have to be forced to serve as basically law enforcement officers for federal purposes. So, like, if the ICE agents ordered the judge to, like, hold him down while we get out our handcuffs, the judge doesn't have to do that, nor does anyone else.
No, but they can't move the person away.
This is quite different from that.
Right.
I don't know why Democrats wouldn't just say, the thing they should be saying is what we're saying is, well, she's entitled to her day in court. Right. She has the presumption of innocence. We'll see what comes of this, but we don't believe that illegal immigrants who are facing also charges of, this was a domestic violence issue. It was not just, so it wasn't like, one of the grandmas who's been here forever, not bothering anybody, getting, dragged out of their home. Now, and this person deserves due process too, but it is legitimate for ICE agents. We want ICE agents, if they're going to apprehend illegal immigrants, actually to do so at courts, because it's safer for everyone involved. They know, because to get into a courtroom, you got to go through a metal detector. They know the suspects do not have weapons, and so they can detain a suspect in a way that is safer for them, for the suspect, for bystanders, for everyone. There's so much less room for somebody getting shot or something than when they're going into your home or going into the wrong door or apartment complex or something. This is where we want it to happen.
Or in this guy's case, he ended up being detained on the street outside, which the argument is that causes greater public risk. Just very briefly, Robby, on the point about the fact that this guy was facing charges, to me that also undercuts one of the arguments that you hear generally from some liberal people about judges and courtrooms and ICE agents, which is, if you have illegal immigrants being detained on unrelated cases, could that, for example, discourage someone who's in the country illegally from coming to testify about another crime? That is an argument that I think in general terms maybe has some weight, but in this case where the guy was actually the accused in the domestic violence charge, it's harder to make that argument in my mind.
Very much so. Next up, Marjorie Taylor Greene calling for a pardon for Derek Chauvin. Niall's got a lot to say about that. You'll hear from him. Stay tuned. Niall, what's in your notes today?
Well, you're going to love this one, Robby. You'll have some things to say. Marjorie Taylor Greene must have gone a bit too long without hitting the headlines. Yesterday, the Georgia Congresswoman decided she would put that right. She called for a pardon for Derek Chauvin. That's right, the former Minneapolis cop who murdered George Floyd on video in broad daylight 5 years ago this month. Chauvin has become quite a cause among the online right. Ben Shapiro, Charlie Kirk and Tucker Carlson have all given voice to the idea of a pardon, or at least suggested that Chauvin suffered some grave injustice. They're all wrong. First of all, there was a reason George Floyd's killing shocked the nation, and it was because we all saw it. There it is, there are some of the images from that infamous video, disturbing though they are. At the time, it was largely uncontested that Chauvin had acted with grotesque brutality. Donald Trump was president at the time, and here's his verdict.
Express our nation's deepest condolences and most heartfelt sympathies to the family of George Floyd. A terrible event, terrible, terrible thing that happened. I've asked that the Department of Justice expedite the federal investigation into his death and do it immediately, do it as quickly as absolutely possible. It's a local situation, but we're also making it into a federal situation, and it's a terrible thing. We all saw what we saw, and it's very hard to even conceive of anything other than what we did see. It should never happen, should never be allowed to happen, a thing like that.
The following month, Trump told Sean Hannity that he had been at a meeting with sheriffs and law enforcement officers, and regarding Chauvin, quote, nobody was sticking up for what he did. The criminal complaint against Chauvin timed the duration of the cop's knee on George Floyd's neck at 8 minutes and 46 seconds. Floyd said he couldn't breathe multiple times during the encounter. After George Floyd stopped moving, Derek Chauvin didn't ease up. After George Floyd stopped breathing, Chauvin didn't ease up. So the following year, a jury convicted him of all 3 charges he faced: second-degree murder, third-degree murder, and second-degree manslaughter. The jury, by the way, was comprised of 6 white people and 6 people who were black or multiracial. Chauvin appealed and lost again in 2023. His conviction was upheld, so was his sentence of 22.5 years. Chauvin's fans on the right are mounting a case, but they're just wrong on the facts. Greene, for example, contends that Floyd died from a drug overdose. Others have said he died of a heart attack. Both claims are rooted in a misreading of evidence, specifically of the original autopsy performed on Floyd's body. Yes, that autopsy did indeed find that George Floyd suffered from heart disease. Yes, it did find there was some fentanyl and methamphetamine in his body. But did it find that those things caused his death? No, they weren't what set it in motion. How did the pathologist in question, Dr. Andrew Baker, classify George Floyd's death? As a homicide. And what did Dr. Baker identify as the cause of that homicide? Quote, law enforcement subdual, restraint, and neck compression, unquote. Put more simply, it was caused by Derek Chauvin's knee on his neck. Testifying at Chauvin's trial, Baker testified that the law enforcement actions were, quote, just more than Mr. Floyd could take. And other experts went even further. Here's another doctor, Martin Tobin, a nationally recognized expert on breathing and respiration, testifying at the trial.
Do you have an opinion to a reasonable degree of medical certainty as to whether a person who had none of those pre-existing health conditions, a healthy person, would have died under the same circumstances as Mr. Floyd?
Yes, a healthy person subjected to what Mr. Floyd was subjected to would have died as a result of what he was subjected to.
3, 2.
And here's yet another cold, hard fact that Greene and the rest skip past. Chauvin admitted his actions when he pleaded guilty to federal civil rights charges against him. The Department of Justice noted that Chauvin, quote, admitted that he continued to use force even though he was aware that Mr. Floyd had stopped resisting, talking, and moving, and even though he was aware that Mr. Floyd had lost consciousness and a pulse. Do we need it to be any more clear-cut? Quote, Chauvin admitted that his willful use of unreasonable force resulted in Mr. Floyd's bodily injury and death because his actions impaired Mr. Floyd's ability to obtain and maintain sufficient oxygen to sustain Mr. Floyd's life. Again, Derek Chauvin murdered George Floyd. That's why a jury of his peers convicted him. But the case was bigger than Chauvin and Floyd for a reason. It exposed how vastly different law enforcement, the justice system, and life itself can look for black Americans versus white Americans. And 5 years on, it can feel that that really hasn't changed. Who really, in the innermost honest part of themselves, thinks Marjorie Taylor Greene would be seeking a pardon for a black man who murdered a white man with a knee on his neck? Who honestly thinks that Ben Shapiro or Charlie Kirk or Tucker Carlson have ever had to plausibly consider a cop doing to a member of their family what Derek Chauvin did to George Floyd? Nobody with any ounce of fairness or any sense of reality really believes that. If those people valued George Floyd's life, they wouldn't be rushing to defend George Floyd's murderer. A movement arose to reject their kind of thinking. It arose because it was, in fact, important to say that Black Lives Matter. And as long as we have the Marjorie Taylor Greenes of the world, people trying to help a white cop literally get away with murder, it will still be important to say it. In 2025, no less than 2020, or any other year, Black lives do indeed still matter.
Well, look, I don't disagree with you maybe as much as you expect here. I would not relitigate this case or open up a pardon. I think Derek Chauvin is morally responsible for the death of George Floyd because he broke police protocol to kneel on his neck for that length of time, and it was not necessary to do that. The car was right there. You have the handcuffs. Once you have the suspect under control, you cuff him, you put him in the car. You don't kneel on their neck for 8 minutes. He should have reasonably known that was putting this guy in a very perilous situation, and indeed it did result in his death. The medical examiner said, well, yes, there are other factors, his heart condition, fentanyl, but you're right, you introduced the video of the person saying, well, he would have, that's that person's opinion, that would have died anyway. It doesn't really matter. There can be other factors, but still he should not have done that. And so he should be punished to some degree. I think maybe you and I just have a different attitude about how long a prison sentence is appropriate for this kind of thing. I don't think I can't mind read him. I don't think he intentionally killed George Floyd. I think it was a reckless kind of conduct that he ought to have known put George Floyd at serious risk, and thus punishing him for some length of time is appropriate. I don't know that I would put it at 22 years personally. I just don't think I feel that way about it, but I wouldn't really relitigate the case. Where I do disagree, however, is in the framing of this, the widespread adopting of this as a racial issue whatsoever. It was inappropriate to do this to this person, regardless of the race of the police officer or the race of the victim. And there is no evidence, not a shred of evidence has ever been presented to demonstrate that Derek Chauvin's actions were motivated by racial animus. So I don't understand why this became the textbook example of police racism. I know there are racist police officers, just as there are racist mail delivery men and racist everything. And you can try to argue that there's more of a racial problem in policing, and we can have an argument about that. But there was nothing racial about this case to me.
I just totally disagree with that. I mean, I think that the backlash against Chauvin's conviction, for a start, as I made the point in the notes, is from people who would not dream of making the case if the races of the people were reversed. When you say there's no evidence that Derek Chauvin acted out of racial animus, no one, I don't think, is suggesting that he went on duty saying, I'm going to kill a black guy. But the argument, which I certainly would believe, is that there is a tendency among a whole swathe of society to presume criminality, to presume, to some extent, less care, to believe that more rough or aggressive police action is necessary when the person being apprehended is black. And so Derek Chauvin, for the record, had, I believe, 18 complaints against him before the George Chauvin case ever arose. So the idea that we can just pretend that this wasn't a racial case, I just don't believe that. We just fundamentally disagree. On the point of sentencing, he was convicted of murder. I don't think that 22 and a half years is excessive for murder, particularly in those cases. The actual charge of second-degree unintentional murder talks about exactly the point you raised. It does not require premeditation. It requires someone to be killed while another felony is taking place, the felony here being an assault on George Floyd. So I don't have any problem with the sentencing.
Next up, social media has a field day with Don Lemon's latest meltdown. You won't want to miss it. Don Lemon calling out President Trump for, quote, blatantly racist, insert expletive here, and he's getting skewered for it on social media. Here he was raging on his podcast Tuesday. Take a look.
This South African farmer bullshit, which is the most blatantly obvious racist shit ever. It is, there's no question about it. There's no discussing it. There's no nothing. It is blatantly obvious the way that we treat white South Africans.
The ex-CNN host blasted POTUS after he greenlit Afrikaners, white South Africans with roots to Dutch settlers, to seek refuge in America.
Trump has defended those Afrikaners, claiming the white farmers are victims of genocide under South Africa's land reform laws. The South African government vigorously denies those allegations. A group of 59 white South Africans landed at Dulles Airport in Virginia on Monday. Trump announced they will be, quote, essentially extended citizenship.
Social media users lit into Lemon. Conservative media personality Tomi Lahren posts on X, quote, race hustler Don Lemon sinks to new lows. Influencer Ian Miles Chong posted, Don Lemon and a guest are extremely concerned that the Afrikaner refugees from South Africa are going to replace the handful of black farmers. What an embarrassment of a human being. He isn't hiding his racism anymore. Is he? I think we're going to fight about this now.
I think this is going to be fairly spicy. I believe Don Lemon is right in this one. We've been critical of Don Lemon on this show lots of times. Ian Miles Chung making those comments, I mean, people should Google Ian Miles Chung and Hitler to see whether they think he's in a good moral position to be making those kind of claims. Look, the point here is that Donald Trump has provided refugee status to white South Africaners, while basically denying or shuttering a program for refugees from other parts of the world to come here. So it just seems obvious on its face that the reason that is the case is that refugees in other parts of the world are primarily coming from non-white parts of the world, whether that's the Democratic Republic of Congo, whether it's China, whether it's Libya, but white Afrikaners are okay. Of course, it is racially oriented.
It's racist to let white people into the country. It's a small number of individuals who will make no difference whatsoever if they're here. I don't have any problem. I don't see how anyone could have any problem with them coming here, wholly independent of whatever the situation is in South Africa. I don't have enough information to characterize it as a genocide, and a lot of people have said there is not a basis for that. Fine, there's not a basis for it. I don't care. They can come here. Why not? It's so weird that this is the one group of immigrants that people are exercising themselves about, that there's some problem with this. What is the problem? I don't get. The problem is just that other immigrants are not being let into. That is the extent of the problem.
The problem.
Okay, well, the Afghan refugees program I would keep, as I said yesterday. The others, I would do it on a case-by-case basis. But it's not about, I mean, the MAGA view of immigration or refugees or humanitarian is that it's not our problem to fix everything in the world or to invite all of the dispossessed, unwashed masses to come to America, to be much choosier about who gets to live here. And it's fine if this small, it was like, it's a couple dozen people, right? It's not a lot of people.
Your point, your question is, what is the problem? Yeah. The problem is discrimination. The problem is that there were about 12,000 people. There were 12,000 people who had already qualified for refugee status, who got shut down by Trump for no good reason. And the one exception he makes is a group of people descended from the group that drove apartheid in South Africa.
We're all descended
against black
from
people.
Somebody.
The point is, Robby, that these are the accusation that white people in South Africa face a genocide is absurd. White people in South Africa are much more wealthy on average than black South Africans. The vast bulk of farmland in South Africa continues to be owned by white people. This Expropriations Act that Elon Musk is all in a twist about has not so far led to any land being expropriated at all and is subject to judicial review. And you set that against the really horrendous suffering that people in all other parts of the world, lots of places around the world suffer, and they're not let in, but Afrikaners are?
But we're not admitting them, or I'm not admitting them because they're suffering or not suffering, admitting them because they are wealthy. We want wealthy people to move to America. Wealthy people are not going to be are not going to contribute to crime problems or social disorder or be net takers from the welfare state. So it's fine for them to come here. That is the reason for immigration. You said it's discriminatory. You said there's no basis for denying or changing that. Well, how do you know that? I mean, what if they reviewed the policy?
Passed.
Right, but they have the Trump administration has a different set of priorities.
Yeah,
for which people get to come here. Not white people. People who are wealthy, small number of immigrants are not going to negatively impact the country at all. Their view of some of these refugee programs is that they don't want to overwhelm small towns or America or flood the welfare system or the healthcare system or contribute to some underlying social disorder. That's the Trump administration view.
The United States, under Republican and Democratic past presidents, has made the argument or has held the belief, which is a true and valuable belief, that a relatively small number of people should be given refugee status in advance and be allowed to come to this country. This is different from people showing up on the southern or any other border and claiming asylum. This is people who apply to acquire the status of refugees from outside the country and are then admitted into the United States. The issue here is not assimilation. The issue is there genuine suffering on the people who are seeking refuge in America? There isn't any significant suffering on the part of Afrikaners. There is immense suffering on the part of people who have already come here and been thankfully given refuge, and there is suffering on the part of people who have been applied and cleared for that purpose. And those people are being blocked, and the idea that that's okay because some of them are poorer than these Afrikaners, I think is frankly an immoral belief.
All right, we disagree very strongly on this one.
Up next, Suge Knight makes a shocking prediction from prison, saying Trump could pardon Sean Diddy Combs if Combs is convicted. Stay with us. The View's Sonny Hostin says she's worried about Sean Diddy Combs' male majority jury in his sex trafficking trial. She's concerned they won't recognise the classic victim grooming by Combs as his former girlfriend Cassie Ventura takes the stand. Let's take a look.
Now, what I saw as a former sex crimes prosecutor is classic victim, survivor, sexual grooming, right? He started pushing her boundaries and trauma bonded. But in watching the jury, I also saw some of the jurors just not understanding how she didn't just leave. And so I think that in order for the prosecution to prove this case, and it's a heavily male jury, there are 12 men and about 8 women.
Meanwhile, the former CEO of Death Row Records, Suge Knight, who I had no idea who that was until Niall just told me, made some shocking predictions about the trial. He thinks President Trump could pardon Diddy if convicted. He made the remarks from prison on News Nation's Cuomo. Let's watch.
Puffy's gonna be all right and have a fair shot at it because Puffy he's not a dummy, and I'm quite sure somebody's gonna talk to those jurors and convince one or two of them, and that's all he needs is one. So at the end of the day, it's gonna be a real exciting situation, but I think he's gonna be all right.
As a reminder, Combs was indicted in the fall of last year on charges of sex trafficking, racketeering, and transportation to engage in prostitution. His trial officially began May 12th in downtown Manhattan. It's expected to last 8 weeks in all. Ventura's testimony has been the focus of the trial so far, as she outlines the abuse she says she endured during their decades-long relationship.
So this is one of those stories where you get to flex your cultural
hip-hop knowledge,
which vastly exceeds mine. Obviously, I know who Sean P. Diddy Combs is, and we've been following this trial. I don't know, Sonny was, per usual, very off base to me there. I just don't vibe with her comments. I think the jury is perfectly able, and also it's okay, 12 men and 8, it's not so lopsided.
Right.
Also, you know, the prosecutor, they have to prove their case. They have to prove that this was willful abuse and not and that it was not consensual and all of that. They've introduced a lot of compelling evidence. To my mind, what sticks out to me is the documented proof of him, not just her being with him and something going wrong, but him barging into her own house and threatening her. That was corroborated. There was some video footage I was watching just this morning of him attacking this guy in a hallway. There's good, solid, irrefutable evidence of real violent, bad behavior by him being presented that takes it out of the realm to me of he said, she said, or she says it's not consensual, but she came over and she agreed to do all these things. She willfully took the kinds of defenses he could make. I think we're seeing some evidence that really cuts against that, and I leave it to the jury to decide what to make of it. But we're seeing it, and it speaks for itself.
Yeah, the video that I think is perhaps the most sort of famous or infamous element in all of this is the video in the hotel where he is dragging Cassie Ventura and I mean, it's pretty gross violence, and there's no, there's no even slight justification for it. Now, I have not read the statute. I mean, obviously, sex trafficking is one of the charges he faces. Sonny Hostin's point, I think, is that Cassie Ventura did stay in a relationship with Sean Combs for a long period of time. And I guess Sonny's point is, well, will men be more likely to think that that means Cassie consented to this behavior? I'm not all that sure that they will. I mean, Cassie Ventura has testified in some detail about physical abuse beyond the video that I'm just talking about, and the idea that she was intimidated from leaving, not only by Sean Combs's status or wealth, but by the fact that he apparently or allegedly said that he would release very embarrassing sexual videos of her if she were to go.
It's blackmail.
So exactly. So that I mean, the evidence that we have seen certainly, to my mind, proves Sean Combs a terrible person. Yes, he of course is having his time in court right now. Of course, he has the right to try to push back on the charges against him, obviously, but I mean, it's pretty grim evidence.
Right, because we're seeing evidence being presented of violence, not just, again, some kind of sexual circumstance where you say it wasn't consensual, but I say it was, and who knows.
It's not really he said, she said in relation to the violence.
Right.
Yeah.
I remember covering cases or reading cases, again, Title IX campus ones where some long relationship and the alleged victim said, well, over the course of this relationship, we had consensual sex, 20 times, but time number 14 was non-consensual, and that's why I'm filing this complaint. I'm like, well, barring any other evidence of that, I wouldn't do anything with that. There were 13 prior and 7 subsequent, and there was no. But again, this is not that, because we're seeing actual video evidence and corroboration of violence, so which lends a lot of credibility to what she's saying.
Right, and to the Sonny Hostin point, the weight of that evidence seems to me so far likely to persuade any fair-minded person that this was a coercive relationship. I mean, obviously we're two men sitting here talking about it, but I don't think that men are so blind to notions of coercion, or certainly notions of blatant violence, that they go, oh well, she stayed in the relationship. I mean, that doesn't seem to
Now, charging it as sex trafficking is kind of an interesting thing, and I do have, and actually one of my colleagues at Reason Magazine, Elizabeth Nolan Brown, who's been on the show a couple times, who writes a lot about sex trafficking and how the criminal justice system and police prosecutors have used that as a catch-all term, actually mostly to pursue consensual prostitution or sex work, which we as libertarians don't really even think should be illegal in the first place. As she argues that the way it is charged tends to actually hurt or assume victimhood in some cases for people who do not even view themselves as victims. We kind of, as a society, have a very misguided notion of even what sex trafficking is, because there's a lot of... have you seen these? Have you traveled lately in airports now? They're everywhere. There's these signs saying, watch out for human trafficking.
Sure.
There's some young person pictured, and you're supposed to be looking out for it. That's trying to introduce some idea that like people are being grabbed at airports and malls and being sex trafficked kids. That never happens. There are almost zero circumstances of that. People are forced into coercive work and coercive sex work, not by random strangers who grab them. Almost virtually always, it's by someone they knew, by a family member, friend, some trusted parental figure. Total random stranger grabbing you, chaining you to a radiator. I'm not saying it's never happened, but statistically it's almost zero. So to be warning people that they got to be on guard for that kind of thing is just not where the real problem is in this category of crime.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know enough about the specifics or the statistics about that. Elizabeth, I think, is a very good journalist, and I'm sure she's made strong points there. In relation to Suge Knight and this idea that Trump will pardon Combs even if he is convicted, I'm not really sure what he's basing that on. It appears to be, I think, the idea that Trump is somehow well disposed toward famous people, or there is a reference that Knight made to another music executive who was granted clemency by Trump. But I mean, this idea that, oh well, Trump would obviously pardon him. I don't even mean this as an anti-Trump point. I just don't know where that's coming from.
Has Diddy
really
been saying that he's a victim of the deep state, the same deep state that got our glorious president Donald Trump? If he's going for the Trump pardon, that's the angle to start in on.
Following the Eric Adams, Bob Menendez footsteps, and see if that works for him.
Yeah, we'll see.
We shall.
All right, Congress members asleep at the wheel, literally asleep. We'll discuss. Let's be real. Congressional meetings can be total snooze fests. It looks like some members of Congress agree.
Multiple lawmakers were caught sleeping on the job this week. One of those lawmakers was Congressman Blake Moore of Utah. There he is. The House Ways and Means Committee, which is writing the tax section of Trump's big, beautiful bill, had been meeting for 14 hours.
Someone had to wake Moore up so he could vote on a Democrat-proposed amendment. The House Energy and Commerce Committee also held a marathon meeting that lasted 26 hours. They were debating Medicaid cuts, another aspect of the big, beautiful bill.
Now, here's Congresswoman Debbie Dingell. Well, we did see her briefly until we returned to my face. But anyway, she's 71 and she fell asleep. But Dingell hit back at her critics on social media, writing, "Been up for 31 hours straight, fighting Republicans trying to gut Medicaid. Closed my eyes to think about an America where everyone has access to quality, affordable health care."
Congresswoman Jan Schakowsky, who's 80, she also dozed off at the Energy and Commerce Committee meeting. Many on social media were blasting these sleepy lawmakers and alluding to the need for term limits. Reason reporter Billy Binion, however, responded to a clip of Dingell sleeping, writing, "This viral clip is extremely misleading. They were pulling an all-nighter. Republican Blake Moore, who's all of 44, also fell asleep. I hate our gerontocracy as much as the next person, but let's at least be fair and accurate." Yeah, I'm actually going to give our elected representatives a pass this time because they were up really late.
Yes, all through the night.
They were up. It's okay. And these meetings can be boring. And it's not like there's so many of them. It's not like you're summoned to do everything at every moment of the meeting. You know, a lot of them got to fly all over the place. They're on crazy schedules. This is not an example. And, you know, I am not forgiving of age-related infirmities of Congress, cognitive decline, physical impairment, any of that. I'm like, no. But perfectly able-bodied, mentally with it people can be exhausted and fall asleep in in special circumstances, as was this committee meeting, right?
Sure, no, absolutely. And let me make a rare moment of praise for your colleagues over at Reason there. Billy Binion making that point, I think, is very valid. The clip of Dingell was kind of passed around with this reference to her age. She's in her early 70s. But the Republican congressman that we saw at the start is in his mid-40s and was obviously quite tired after a long and perhaps not particularly fascinating night of marking up or debating tax policy and the finer points of it. One of the open secrets of Washington reporting is that a lot of what happens in Congress is pretty dull. And if you go there or are sitting in a committee after been up for an all-nighter through all of that, then I think it's pretty understandable that people lapse into having a little bit of a snooze. I liked with the Republican that a colleague of his next to him kind of woke him up, stirred him, and he had a little chuckle about that and voted whatever way she told him to vote, which is how it goes.
I love when you catch a TV personality dozing off. There's a famous clip of Tucker Carlson.
Really?
It's called All Tuckered Out. Back when he was on Fox and Friends, and he was, at that time, he was commuting, I believe, from D.C. to New York to do it. This was when I worked for him at the Daily Caller, where Amber Duke now works. And Tucker, co-founded that website years ago before he moved to Fox full-time. He was the editor-in-chief of it, but he was doing appearances on Fox, morning appearances in New York. So he was doing just ridiculous hours to do this show in New York, commuting from D.C. And they came, and he used to he would nap during the commercial breaks. He would get in like a 90-second nap, and they came back live, and they forgot to wake him up, and he was just asleep on camera.
We don't do that, right? We're here sharp and ready to roll.
Well, you know what? We should let our audience know. We'll see about that next week, because the show is actually going to be moving. We're just going to be taping it a little bit earlier. It really won't affect anybody watching, except actually maybe the videos will get up a little bit more earlier. We're also going to be trying out a live thing, which should be exciting. So there'll be none of our, if we're making mistakes, it's just going to go to print, so to speak.
We never make mistakes.
We never make mistakes.
It's flawless all the time.
But we might be like at our desks.
Particularly since we have to start a little bit earlier in the morning.
We have to start earlier. I don't know when I'm going to fit in my morning trip to the gym, Niall. I don't think I'm going to be able to make it before the show starts anymore.
Afternoon trips to the gym will be less busy.
Yeah, but I got other stuff to do in the afternoon. So I'm going to have to go. I'm going to have to go to the gym and then go to Reason Magazine, and then I can't do it at the end of the day because I skip it. I don't know.
So I don't like working out at the end of the day, because then what is it, the things that make you feel lively after you have exercise?
Alcohol. What?
Not alcohol, Robby. I'm trying to think of the chemicals that are sort of
endorphins.
Endorphins.
Yes.
Thank you. That's the word I was looking for. The endorphins keep me awake if I go for a run late at night. I'm more
interesting.
But if I'm working from home, a run in the afternoon is the optimum time, because then I don't want to nap.
I actually took a nap yesterday for the first time in a while, and it was lovely. I've had trouble sleeping as of late, and I just wake up a lot in the night. And I finally started taking melatonin, which is what people recommend for that. And I always just thought that was some like astrology, woman, yoga type nonsense. But I'm so dismissive. But it works. I've been getting a much better sleep since I started taking it.
Have you considered running for Congress, perhaps? And you'd be put asleep by all night markups of tax bills and doze off.
Yes, that's why I am forgiving of them, because we all have sleeping problems, and it is difficult in this modern day. I do blame the phones a little bit.
Yeah.
Have you heard the blue light theory?
Yeah.
It's the light behind the text
that makes us all kind of slightly stressed. Yeah.
I try to keep when I've decided I'm going to bed, I will not look at my phone anymore. That is like my pledge to myself, because it never stops if you start.
My best, very cheap investment recently was paying about $8 for an old-style alarm clock, and I put my phone in a different room.
Really?
Yes.
I think I'm going to have to do that.
It's the way
I think
forward.
That's a good idea. Yeah.
There we go.
All right. Well, that does it for us today on Rising. Like we said, we'll be back next week at a slightly different taping hour, but it won't affect the content or your way of consuming it. You can also be sure to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss any of our content. And for those of you who like to listen while on the go, we're now available anywhere that you can find podcasts. We appreciate you watching, commenting, chiming in, telling us how you like the show, and we'll see you back here next week. Of course, there will be a show tomorrow that Niall is not a part of. It'll be Amber and a mystery guest. You actually won't want to miss it. See you later.